Welcome to another episode of The Cynical Writer. Before we get started, I would just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this channel, the best way to do that is to purchase my books. And I've left a link in the description section in case you're interested. And my most recent book is called The Ecstasy and the Ignominy, which is essentially a literary historical novel. It's it's somewhat of a combination between A Tale of Two Cities, Anna Karenina, and also a bit of Crime and Punishment as well. And the book that I've written before that, and I'm advertising this because I will be talking about it in today's video, is Silent Reckoning, which is essentially somewhat like The Great Gatsby. And so today I wanted to talk about why are conservatives so bad at making art? And of course, I'm not talking about all conservatives. There are some good conservative artists, but I'm mainly talking about conservative more as a movement. Now, if I wanted to think of good modern conservative artists, I could think of, for example, especially in cinema, I could think of, let's see, Mel Gibson, and in literature, which even though I'm not really up to date on modern literature, James Elroy is somewhat conservative, and he's a good writer. Very different from me, but he is a good writer. But I do think conservatives in general, especially modern conservatives, are not very good at making art, which I'm not coming at this, by the way, from a perspective of animosity towards conservatives. I'm someone myself who I lean independent. I'm someone in the middle. I have some conservative beliefs, some liberal beliefs. This video isn't really about my particular beliefs, although I will touch on them somewhat. I am a Christian, and therefore my worldview is informed by that. So I do hold to some conservative beliefs, especially surrounding sexual ethics. But at the same time, I'm also very much an egalitarian when it comes to the two genders and all of that. And that is something that is definitely not conservative. And but I tend to take my cue when it comes to morality more from what I believe is biblical, and not because I think something is either traditional or untraditional. That informs my worldview as well as certain intuitions that are philosophy based. Um, that informs my worldview, and so I have a mixture of different kinds of beliefs. But to me, this is not a diatribe, so to speak, against conservatives, because to me, I actually wish I could see more good conservative art. But I don't see it a lot. And I will say that I don't really like giving examples of so-called conservatives from the past, because what it meant to be a conservative or a liberal in the past was very different from today. You can take any artist from, let's say, the 19th century who was considered, let's say, liberal for their time, and if you put them in the modern context, they'll seem very conservative even to other conservatives. Um, with the exception of perhaps the Romantics, some of them like Lord Byron and Percy Shelley had some views and did some things that would make even the most liberal of people now blush. But especially if you're talking about the Victorian period or the early mid 20th century, definitely there are many differences. And so so to me it's like one should never say, oh, Shakespeare was a conservative or a liberal, this or that, because that what it means to be that is very different now. So I don't really like applying those labels. And so, but why? But so what I'm talking about is primarily in the modern context. Um, but one of the reasons why I think many conservatives are so bad, and I'll get to the problems with liberals in a minute. And I guess I will say that these terms are arbitrary; they change over time. I'm mainly using them as descriptive labels. I know there are exceptions to all of these things. I honestly wish people would be more open in their ideologies, and not try to label themselves all the time as being liberal, conservative, or this or that. Um, and would just try to express their views with nuance. They don't. But so this is primarily, I'm primarily using descriptive terms here. But one of the reasons why I think that conservatives are really bad at creating art is because conservatives really aren't willing quite often to look at the dark side of life, the ugly side of life. Because here's the thing is that many conservatives are very squeamish about portraying violence and especially sex of any kind in art because somehow they think that will promote sin of some kind. And this can particularly be true of the religious kind of conservative. But here's the thing there's a huge difference between how you think life should be in terms of how people should live it and how life actually is. um, Good art portrays the human condition honestly and authentically, which requires showing the dark and ugly side of life. It requires showing the dark side of humanity. The greatest art ever, such as Shakespeare's Macbeth and Hamlet and Crime and Punishment and Tale of Two Cities. You think of the great art. It's constantly exploring sin, the nature of sin, the nature of adultery, of sexual obsession. And these are things that conservatives typically shy away from because they have this puritanical philosophy that is ultimately stifling. And yet, if you actually want to make good art, you have to explore the darker side of humanity. You have to explore the human condition because that's what art is all about. And through that, if you are a good storyteller, you will end up confirming and affirming conservative values in many cases. But you have to go through the darkness to find the light. If you stay in the light, then it will become too bright and everything will become stale and stagnant and soulless. And that's the problem with conservative art is that it often just becomes stale and stagnant and soulless. Um, One example that I can give you is that, for example, I was listening to this conservative pundit recently who said who said that actors who kiss on screen are engaging in adultery or something like that. And I'm thinking, okay, with that attitude, conservatives are going to keep losing with that attitude because the thing is that storytelling, art is about exploring themes and and conflicts that would be considered dangerous to explore in real life, but within the context of art, you can explore those themes in a nuanced and safe way. And by taking that attitude, when conservatives take that puritanical attitude, they become entirely stagnant when it comes to trying to make good art, and they will never succeed that way. And so, when conservatives become very puritanical, um, their art becomes stagnant. And to me, I heard one conservative artist put it like this, and I would agree, where it's fine to want your life to be like a Hallmark movie. It's another thing to watch a Hallmark movie because if you create art where there's no conflict, where there's no nuance, then that becomes ultimately that becomes bad art and it's boring. And you have to explore again the darker side of life in order to find the light. And I'll show you what I mean. Like in my book, Silent Reckoning, I do affirm here a certain conservative value. Hold on, I need to find it around the issue of human life because I am a pro-life person, but I explore this theme through a character of Jeannie Anderson, who is molested. She is taken advantage of in a way, and there's a lot of dark stuff here. And there comes a point in the story where she finally admits that she had an abortion and feels extremely guilty over it. But I'll read you that passage where she finally confesses it. Of course, this is a spoiler, but this really is the heart and center of the book here, where she says, "What do you want me to say? That I murdered my child? All right, I'll say it. I murdered my child. I fucking murdered my child. They would be 17 now. I took away their precious years of youth, desperate to conceal the shame that was forced upon me, upon my body, upon my soul. I wanted to rid myself of a poisonous seed. I suppose I did. But sometimes even venomous roots can blossom into exquisite gardens. Right in the palm of my hand, I had a jewel worth more than all of the treasures in heaven, and for the price of autonomy I threw it away, thus becoming a slave, I declared, burying my face in my trembling hands. And so here I explore the theme of abortion in a very complex and nuanced way, where where I try to show that the character of Jeannie Anderson realized that she was trying to prevent her pregnancy for the sake of autonomy, but by doing that, she took a life and became a slave to her own sinful desires, to her own tragic nature. That by giving into that, she thought she was going to be liberated. She thought she was going to get rid of the trauma, but in the end, she just made the trauma 10 times worse by taking a life. And that we cannot erase sin by committing another sin, because ultimately that makes us a slave to our own desires, because it is not life affirming. And so that was the point of that passage. And but I did it in a very messy and brutal way, because life is messy, life is complicated, and so I explored suffering in a very visceral way there. But many conservatives are afraid to go to such a place, because that they have this idea that they many conservatives, particularly of the religious kind, do not have any kind of nuance in their philosophy. Everything is black and white, and they have this what I would call fanatic certainty that actually prevents you from getting to the truth. Because in order to get to the truth, you need to have a certain level of doubt in order to actually find the truth. But by clinging so desperately to that fanaticism, you actually end up destroying um, the very things that you cherish, because you're not willing to actually learn from your mistakes. And so, so to me, conservatives can be very stagnant for that reason. And now another issue that I wanted to explore is the fact that is that many conservatives are bad at art simply because they do not value art in the art for its own sake. That they do not want to fund the arts. They do not want to um, give the arts funding. They do not want to because a lot of conservatives will say, well, you need to do something practical. Forget about that art. If it doesn't make money, then it's not worth pursuing. But obviously, you're not going to win over any kind of culture with that attitude. Because I think in many cases, like I don't think, like to me, I don't want this to happen. Like when it comes to things like cutting PBS, for example, I entirely disagree with that, because for one, I believe that public education and the public art, I think it should be a place where all kinds of artists can thrive, liberal or conservative. But to me, it doesn't even make sense from a practical standpoint, because if you are a conservative and you want to change the culture, wouldn't it be better instead to take over PBS or to take over the universities and actually fill them with your own conservative ideas? See, it seems to me that would be, if you wanted to win the culture, that would be the way to do it. Um, by actually banning these programs or cutting these programs, you actually entrench the people who hate you further, and you become even more isolated, and they become more isolated. And that actually has the opposite effect of what you want. But in order to actually take over the culture that way, you actually have to know about something about art and appreciate art. Um, and many conservatives simply don't. And so, and so conservatives, in many cases, end up shooting themselves in the foot um, with these kinds of attitudes. And so, and to me, another thing is that when it comes to things like family values and Christian values and things of that nature, is that many of those values simply do not align with the value of big business, of promoting profit over everything else. And that's another thing, is that I don't think that in particular social conservatism actually is compatible with the idea of big business. Because if you have a situation where, because what's best for the family isn't always going to be what's best for a big corporation. And that's another reason why I don't really identify as a conservative, because to me, it's like the things that I value, which I do value things like family values in the sense of having monogamy and having a stable family, but those values simply do not align with corporate greed, which is one reason why I don't identify as a conservative, because I cannot reconcile that, and also just the puritanical nature of conservatism repulses me, even though there are certain ideas that I would agree with. Like I can give you an example, like for example, like I think that the worship of, let's say, the current president is not good for really the idea of conservatism or just morality in general or Christianity, because um, the current president, I believe, actually is the ultimate example of anti-intellectualism. Of He's kind of like if Biff from Back to the Future became the president. And it's not so much him; it's the people who worship him. It's the people, and I'm not coming at this, by the way, from a partisan perspective, where like I can understand why many people get upset when, let's say, certain celebrities critique the president because they're coming at it purely from an ideologically left perspective. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm talking about this much broader, just as if you are if because I'm coming at it from the perspective of morality, of when someone builds their campaign purely off of ignorance and hate, of a contempt for critical thinking, and a contempt for the basic humanity of others. When you actually align yourself with that does, I think, demonstrate something about your character. And it's one thing I understood why some people did it in the beginning, when in 2016, when they were ignorant about, his behavior. um Even I naively voted for him in 2016, mainly because I didn't know what he was going to be like, as president. But I didn't vote for him in 2020 or 2024, because but to me, it's like when you know what someone is like, when you know that they are essentially authoritarian, that they disregard the rule of law and such, and you still go that way, then it's hard to sympathize when, let's say, you may have regrets later on. And but people like the current president, they are the ultimate example of people who do not respect the arts, who don't even know what the arts is, who even probably haven't even read a book, and they solely use ignorance and prejudice for the sake of control. And now I'm sorry I got so political, but the very nature of this topic is political, so I think it is entirely appropriate to go there. But as long as conservatism is intermixed with the idea of hatred and anti-intellectualism, it will continue to lose in the culture wars. And again, I'm not saying this as someone who wants conservatism to entirely fail. I wish conservatism was more represented within the culture, but conservatives often shoot themselves in the foot because their philosophies are entirely incoherent. Now, I am not, this is not a defense, by the way, of the left either. They have their own problems, where the left can also be quite moralistic at times and quite pious, that the left is often consumed with the idea of moral relativism, of nothing, of there not being any true right and wrong, and they often can be obsessed with things like identity politics. And my book, The Ecstasy and the Ignominy, critiques that quite well, where you have essentially a case where you have a communist revolution led by the character of Bertrand Shaw, which ultimately ends in disaster because his moral relativism ends up being his undoing. But again, I explore that through violence, through drama, through darkness, and conservatives are often put off by that, but that is what's required if you actually want to explore the human condition in an honest way, because that's what art is about. Art is about ultimately conveying the truth. And in order to do that, you have to sometimes go to very dark places, but conservatives are often afraid to do that. And so, but I think ultimately they end up shooting themselves in the foot at the end of the day when they refuse to go there. And so but I think that if conservatives would just be a little more nuanced in their thinking, and if they would try to be genuinely intellectually curious, then I think, and also not place so much value on on money and materialism, I think they would be in a much better place when it comes to actually having influence in the culture. So this was a long video. I hope you enjoyed it. Um, Again, if you would like to support this channel, my books are linked in the description section. And until next time, goodbye.